Celia of Missouri was not born into freedom. She was born into a world where her very existence was defined by chains, ownership, and silence. To understand Celia's story, we must step back into the mid-1800s, a time when slavery shaped the social, economic, and moral foundation of much of the United States. Missouri, the place where Celia's life unfolded, was a slave-holding state. It sat at the edge of the American frontier, carrying both the harsh realities of plantation life and the constant tension between free and slave states. For Celia, this world meant her childhood was stolen before it had even begun. Historical records about Celia's early years are sparse, but what we do know is enough to imagine the weight of her reality. She was only 14 years old when she was purchased by Robert Newsom, a wealthy farmer in Missouri. At that tender age, most children are discovering dreams, laughter, and innocence. But for Celia, the moment she was bought by Newsom was the moment her childhood ended. Celia was not seen as a child. She was seen as property. And from the very first night in Newsom's household, she was forced into the role of his victim. Every step she took on the farm reminded her that she was enslaved. Every command she received was a reminder that her life did not belong to her. And yet, Celia carried herself with resilience. She cooked, she cleaned, and she endured, because enslaved people had little choice but to endure. But Celia's story was not one of quiet submission. It was a story of fire, defiance, and a breaking point. To fully grasp why Celia's act would later shock Missouri and the nation, we must understand the suffocating cage she lived in. Day after day, Celia faced both physical labor and personal violation. She was trapped in a cycle of abuse at the hands of Newsom, and this abuse was not hidden. It was part of the cruel reality enslaved women endured under slavery. As the seasons passed, Celia grew from a girl into a young woman. But the years of exploitation left deep scars. She lived in a society where enslaved women were never protected, never given the dignity of choice, and never allowed to claim their own bodies as their own. This system left Celia with little hope, except for the fire that grew inside her, a fire that one day would erupt. Celia's life in those early years is a reminder of the weight of slavery, endless labor in the fields, the back-breaking work in the household, and the constant fear of punishment. The rules of slavery were brutal, and any act of resistance was met with violence. But Celia, even in silence, carried within her the seed of resistance. She was a teenager, but she had already endured years of cruelty. She had already lost the innocence that others her age cherished. Celia of Missouri was more than just another enslaved woman in the history books. She was a young woman whose suffering reached a point where her voice could no longer be silenced. Section by section, her story unfolds, not as a tale of crime alone, but as a desperate fight for dignity in a world designed to crush her spirit. And in this first chapter of her life, we see the making of that fire. The slow build of pain and resilience that would one day explode into a moment that history could never erase. Celia's name echoes through history, not because she was born free, but because she was forced into slavery and pushed to the edge of human endurance. From the very first night Robert Newsom brought her to his farm, Celia's nightmare began. Imagine a girl of 14, taken from everything familiar, delivered into the hands of a man who saw her not as a child, not as a human being, but as property to be used at will. Celia's first night in Newsom's household marked the beginning of years of abuse. Newsom forced himself upon her, turning her cabin into a prison of pain. This was not a one-time horror. It was a cycle that repeated night after night, year after year. For Celia, there was no escape. She was enslaved, bound by a system that denied her the right to say no, the right to defend her body and the right to claim her humanity. Life on the Newsom farm was already harsh for enslaved people. They worked in the fields from dawn to dusk, tending crops, hauling water, and enduring the blazing sun of Missouri summers and the freezing winds of winter. But for Celia, the physical toil was only one part of her suffering. The greatest wound was the constant violation of her body and spirit. Other enslaved people on the farm must have known, or at least suspected, what Celia endured. Whispered conversations, silent glances. They too lived under the same system, where enslaved women were often forced into sexual servitude. For Celia, this meant she was isolated in her pain, carrying a burden too heavy for anyone to truly share. As years passed, Celia grew older, but her suffering deepened. By the age of 19, she had already lived through years of trauma. She was still so young, but she was worn down by exhaustion, fear, and despair. And yet, even within that despair, Celia began to resist in small ways. She pleaded with Newsom to stop. She begged him to leave her alone. But her words were ignored, because in his eyes, Celia was property, not a person. The more Celia pleaded, the more she understood that no one would protect her. The law would not protect her. Her master would not stop. And the community around her would turn a blind eye. This realization planted the seed of desperation inside her heart. Celia had been silent too long, and she knew she could not survive if the abuse continued. Every night in her cabin, Celia must have felt the weight of dread pressing on her chest. Every time she saw Newsom approaching, her body must have trembled with fear and rage. It was in these moments that Celia began to imagine the possibility of resistance, not as a choice, but as the only way to survive. In this section of Celia's story, we see the cruelty of slavery stripped bare. Celia was not just a worker on a farm. She was a young woman enduring repeated violation, forced into silence and denied justice. And yet, Celia still held on to her humanity. She still found the courage to ask for mercy. She still tried to assert her right to her own body, even in a world that refused to recognize it. This daily torment, this endless cycle of abuse, is what pushed Celia toward the night that would change everything. Her suffering became too great to contain, and her spirit too strong to remain silent. Celia's daily struggles under Newsom's control built the fire of resistance that would one day erupt into an act that history still remembers with shock and awe. By the summer of 1855, Celia of Missouri had endured 5 long years under the control of Robert Newsom. She was 19 years old, but she had already lived through more trauma than most people could ever imagine. Her pleas for mercy had gone unanswered. Her body had been treated as property, and her spirit was weighed down by fear and exhaustion. That June, Celia reached her breaking point. The moment came one night when Robert Newsom once again entered her cabin. Celia, who had begged him to stop, realized that words would never be enough. The abuse would never end as long as Newsom lived. On that night, Celia decided to act. Inside her small cabin, lit only by the dim glow of the fireplace, Celia took hold of a heavy wooden stick. It was an object of survival, an ordinary piece of her environment, but in Celia's hands it became a weapon of resistance. When Newsom approached, Celia struck him. The blow was powerful, fueled by years of pain, rage, and desperation. For the first time, Celia fought back. Newsom collapsed, and in that moment, Celia's life changed forever. She had killed her master. The silence of her cabin must have been deafening, filled with the weight of what she had done. For years, Celia had been powerless, but in that single act, she took back control, if only for a fleeting moment. Terrified, of discovery, Celia acted quickly. She dragged Newsom's lifeless body toward the fireplace. The flames once used to keep her warm now became the tool to hide the truth. Piece by piece, Celia burned her master's body. The fire roared, consuming the man who had consumed her youth. The smell of burning flesh filled the cabin, and Celia must have trembled with fear, knowing that her actions would not remain hidden forever. But in that fire, Celia also burned years of pain and silence. The act was not just one of survival. It was one of defiance. Celia, a young enslaved woman who had been treated as less than human, had stood up against her master and struck back. For a short time, Celia believed she might escape suspicion. But the disappearance of Robert Newsom soon raised questions. Neighbors whispered, family members searched, and eventually suspicion turned toward the young enslaved woman who had lived closest to him, Celia. The night Celia killed Newsom was the turning point of her story. It was the moment when her years of suffering turned into an act of resistance that the world could not ignore. Celia had crossed the line from victim to fighter, from silence to fire, and though her act would lead to her capture and trial, it also secured her place in history as a young woman who dared to resist when no one else would protect her. This section is the climax of Celia's struggle, the moment when she transformed her fear into action. Celia's breaking point was not just about ending her master's abuse. It was about reclaiming the humanity that slavery had tried to strip away. On that fateful night in 1855, Celia of Missouri burned more than just a body. She ignited a story that would echo for centuries. After that fateful night in June 1855, when Celia struck Robert Newsom and burned his body in her fireplace, the farm did not remain silent for long. Celia may have hoped that the fire had erased the evidence of her desperate act, but the absence of a wealthy white man in a small Missouri community could not be ignored. Celia continued her daily tasks as though nothing had happened. She still tended to her cabin, carried water, and prepared meals as expected of her. On the outside, Celia appeared calm, but inside, she carried the heavy weight of fear. Every knock at the door, every glance from another enslaved worker, every passing day brought the possibility that someone would begin to question where Newsom had gone. Robert Newsom's family was the first to notice. He was a man of habit, a farmer whose daily routines were rarely broken. He visited neighbors, attended church, and conducted his business openly. His sudden disappearance was unusual, and whispers quickly spread across the town. Where was Robert Newsom? What had happened on that farm? At first, people assumed Newsom had gone away on business or had taken an unexpected trip. But as days turned into weeks, the questions grew louder. His absence was undeniable. Soon, suspicion crept toward the one person who had been closest to him in his final hours. Celia. Celia's position on the farm made her vulnerable. Everyone knew that Newsom spent time in her cabin. Neighbors may not have spoken openly about it, but in the silence of the community, they understood what it meant for a master to visit an enslaved woman's quarters at night. Now, with Newsom missing, all eyes turned toward the young enslaved woman who had lived in his shadow. When Celia was questioned, she held firm at first. She denied knowing what had happened to Newsom. She tried to maintain the secret she had worked so hard to protect. But the weight of suspicion bore down on her. In a community built on the assumption that enslaved people had no rights, Celia's voice carried little power. The mere fact that she had been near him made her a suspect. Investigators searched for evidence. They looked at the fireplace in Celia's cabin, and though much of Newsom's body had been consumed by the flames, traces remained. Bones, ashes, and fragments revealed the horrifying truth. Celia could not hide what had been done. When confronted with the evidence, Celia confessed. Perhaps it was the crushing pressure of the interrogation, perhaps it was exhaustion from carrying her secret, or perhaps she knew that the truth could no longer be hidden. But Celia admitted that she had killed Robert Newsom. Her confession spread through the town like wildfire. For many, it was shocking that a young enslaved woman had dared to strike back against her master. For others, it was horrifying proof of what they feared, that slavery bred resentment, resistance, and rebellion. In the eyes of white Missourians, Celia was not a victim but a dangerous criminal. Celia was arrested and taken into custody. Her once small private cabin, the site of her suffering and her act of defiance, was now treated as a crime scene. The community that had ignored her pain now turned all its attention toward her, but not with sympathy. Instead, they sought punishment. In those first days of the investigation, Celia must have felt the crushing weight of inevitability. She knew the law was not written to protect her. She knew that her confession would not be seen as an act of self-defense but as murder. And yet, by speaking the truth, Celia gave voice to the years of torment she had endured. This moment in Celia's story marks the shift from resistance to reckoning. She had broken her silence, and now the system of slavery would rise to crush her. Celia of Missouri, the young woman who dared to fight back, was about to face the full force of a legal system that had never recognized her humanity. The arrest of Celia in the summer of 1855 set the stage for one of the most infamous trials in Missouri's history. The trial of a 19-year-old enslaved woman accused of murdering her master was not just a legal proceeding. It was a confrontation between a single woman's cry for justice and the brutal machinery of slavery. Celia was placed in jail to await trial. Alone in her cell, she faced the reality of her situation. She had spoken the truth about her years of abuse, but the society around her did not see her as a victim. They saw her as property that had rebelled against its owner. As the trial began, Celia's case drew attention from across the community. People crowded into the courthouse to hear the details of the shocking crime. Newspapers reported on the proceedings, framing Celia as a dangerous figure who had dared to disrupt the order of slavery. But Celia's defense attorneys saw the truth. They argued that Celia had acted in self-defense. They presented her not as a criminal, but as a young woman who had been forced into years of sexual assault. Their case was bold for the time. They claimed that even as an enslaved woman, Celia had the right to protect her body. This argument was radical in 1855. The law of Missouri did not recognize enslaved women as having legal rights over their own bodies. The system of slavery itself was built on the denial of that very principle. For the court to accept Celia's defense would have meant acknowledging that enslaved women were entitled to bodily autonomy, a truth that threatened the foundation of slavery. Witnesses testified. The courtroom listened to the chilling details of Celia's confession. The jury, composed entirely of white men, heard how Celia had struck Robert Newsom and burned his body in her fireplace. They heard about the years of abuse she had suffered. And yet, the question remained. Would they see her as a human being defending herself, or as property that had destroyed its owner? As the trial unfolded, the weight of the law pressed heavily against Celia. The prosecution painted her as a cold-blooded murderer. They dismissed her pleas, ignored her suffering, and focused only on the act of killing. To them, the abuse she endured was irrelevant. What mattered was that she had defied her master. The jury deliberated, but the outcome was already written in the culture of the time. Celia was convicted of murder. The law had spoken, and it had chosen to deny her humanity. The verdict sent a chilling message to enslaved women everywhere. Even if you defend yourself against the most brutal abuse, the law will not protect you. Celia's trial was not just about one young woman. It was about the system of slavery itself, a system determined to silence the voices of resistance. For Celia, the trial was both a tragedy and a testament. It was a tragedy because justice was denied, but it was also a testament to her courage. Even in the face of a courtroom designed to condemn her, Celia's story of resistance was spoken aloud. Her truth, once buried in silence, had reached the ears of the world. After the trial, Celia's fate was sealed. The young enslaved woman was sentenced to death by hanging. At just 19 years old, she now faced the final days of her life. In the cold confines of her jail cell, Celia must have felt the crushing reality of her sentence. She had fought for her dignity, she had defended her body, and she had spoken her truth. But the society around her had chosen to silence her with death. Each passing day brought her closer to the gallows. Celia's execution date was delayed at first, as appeals were filed. Her lawyers hoped to win her some measure of mercy. They argued again that Celia had the right to defend herself against abuse. But the courts remained unmoved. The appeals failed, and the order for execution stood. During this time, Celia gave birth to a child. Even as she awaited death, her body carried the reminder of her years of abuse. The child, born into slavery, was a living symbol of the horrors Celia had endured. For Celia, the joy of motherhood was clouded by the knowledge that she would not live to raise her child. The baby would grow up enslaved, just as she had. The days passed slowly in her cell. Celia must have thought of her short life, the childhood, stolen from her, the years of pain, and the brief moment of resistance that had changed everything. She may have wondered whether others would remember her story, or whether she would vanish into the silence of history like so many enslaved women before her. On December 21st, 1855, the day of her execution arrived. The town gathered to witness the hanging. Crowds came not only to see justice, as they called it, but to reinforce the power of slavery. They wanted to send a message. No enslaved person could defy their master and live. Celia was led to the gallows. At 19 years old, she stood before the crowd, a young woman facing her final moments. Her courage in those moments remains unrecorded, but we can imagine the strength it took to stand there. She had fought back when no one else would protect her. She had spoken her truth in a courtroom that refused to listen. And now, she faced death with the dignity of someone who refused to be broken. The rope was placed around her neck. The crowd waited, and with a single act, the life of Celia of Missouri came to an end. Her body hung lifeless, but her story endured. Celia's last days remind us of the cost of resistance in a world built on injustice. She paid with her life, but in doing so, she carved her name into history. Celia was more than a victim. She was more than a slave. She was a young woman who dared to resist, even when resistance meant death. Her execution was meant to silence her forever. But instead, it gave her story power. Today, more than a century and a half later, we still speak her name. Celia of Missouri, the enslaved woman who fought back, who resisted her master, and who was condemned by an unjust system, lives on as a symbol of courage and defiance. December 24, 1855, dawned cold and gray in Missouri. For many in the town, this was not just another winter morning. This was the day they would witness the execution of Celia, the 19-year-old enslaved woman who had killed her master and set the community into a storm of fear, outrage, and debate. For Celia, the hours before her death must have been the heaviest of her life. Locked inside her cell, she knew the minutes were slipping away. The execution order had been read. The appeals had failed. The law had decided her fate. Celia, who had endured years of abuse, who had fought back against her master, who had dared to resist, was about to pay with her life. The jailers arrived. Shackles were placed on her wrists. Her footsteps echoed against the stone walls as she was led from her cell to the wagon that would carry her to the place of execution. Each step Celia took was watched by guards, officials, and townspeople who had gathered to see her final moments. Celia's body must have trembled with fear, but her face may have carried the strength of someone who had already faced the worst in life. For 5 years, she had been forced into silence. For 5 years, her body had been treated as property. For 5 years, she had endured the nightmare of Robert Newsom. But on this day, Celia's silence was broken not with words, but with her presence, walking toward death with the dignity of someone who had chosen to resist. The wagon rolled slowly through the town, carrying Celia toward the gallows. Crowds lined the streets. Some came out of curiosity, others to satisfy their anger, and still others to send a message to the enslaved people watching from the shadows. The sight of Celia in chains was meant to remind them resistance would not be tolerated. And yet among the enslaved, Celia's presence carried another meaning. Here was a young woman who had dared to fight back. Even in her final walk, Celia stood as proof that resistance was possible, even when the cost was death. The gallows stood tall, a grim structure of wood against the winter sky. As the wagon stopped, Celia was lifted down. The crowd grew quiet, waiting for the spectacle they had gathered to see. Officials read the charges once more: the murder of Robert Newsom, the burning of his body, and the crime of defiance. Celia stood at the base of the gallows. The rope hung above her, swaying slightly in the cold breeze. She climbed the wooden steps, each footfall echoing across the silent crowd. For Celia, each step must have felt like a lifetime, but she walked forward, her head held high. At the top, the noose was placed around her neck. The crowd shifted, some murmuring, others waiting in silence. In that moment, Celia's 19 years of life condensed into a single truth. She had been a victim, but she had also been a fighter. The executioner gave the signal. The trap was released, and Celia of Missouri, the enslaved woman who had dared to kill her master, was hanged before the watching eyes of her community. Her body hung lifeless, but her story did not end on that scaffold. Celia's execution was meant to silence her forever. Instead, it immortalized her as one of the rare voices of resistance against the brutality of slavery. The execution of Celia sent ripples across Missouri. For white slaveholders, the death of a 19-year-old enslaved woman who had killed her master was not just a punishment. It was a warning. They told themselves it was justice, but in truth, it was fear. Celia had revealed the vulnerability of the system they depended on. She had proven that enslaved people were not always silent, not always submissive, and not always willing to accept their fate. In the days following Celia's execution, white Missourians spoke of the event with a mix of horror and relief. Horror, because the crime itself shook the foundation of their beliefs. Relief, because the swift execution reminded them that the system of slavery still held power. To them, Celia's hanging was not only about punishing one woman, it was about preserving an entire way of life built on oppression. But among the enslaved community, the reaction was very different. Whispers spread across farms and plantations. Celia's story was retold in hushed tones around fireplaces and in the fields. To many enslaved women, Celia represented courage. She was proof that resistance was possible, even if it came at the highest cost. Her name carried both sadness and strength. The enslaved men and women who heard Celia's story may have asked themselves questions they had never dared to speak aloud. What would it mean to resist? What would it mean to take back even a fragment of power from their masters. Celia's act of defiance planted seeds of possibility. The legal community also reacted strongly. Lawyers, judges, and officials debated what the case meant for the law. Some argued that Celia's trial had exposed the deep injustice of denying enslaved women the right to protect themselves. Others defended the verdict, insisting that acknowledging such a right would unravel the very system of slavery. Celia's case forced the law to confront a question it had long ignored. Could an enslaved woman ever be allowed to defend her own body? The answer in 1855 was clear: no. The courts had decided that Celia's life was expendable, her body not her own, her rights non-existent. But the very fact that the question was raised showed that Celia's resistance had shaken the foundations of the system. For Robert Newsom's family, the reaction was personal. They had lost their father, their provider, their patriarch. To them, Celia was not a victim of abuse, but the killer of their kin. Their voices added to the chorus, demanding punishment and silence. Yet even their grief could not erase the truth of Celia's suffering. In the wider abolitionist movement, Celia's case was another piece of evidence of slavery's cruelty. Writers and activists pointed to her story as proof that slavery corrupted not only the enslaved, but also the enslavers. They argued that Celia's life showed how slavery was built on violence, injustice, and the denial of basic human rights. Thus, the reaction to Celia's execution was not simple. It was a mixture of fear, defiance, silence, and debate. White society tried to bury her memory, to turn her into a warning. But among the enslaved, and among those who opposed slavery, Celia became something more. A symbol of courage in the face of unbearable cruelty. In the months and years after her execution, Celia's story did not vanish. Though many in Missouri tried to erase her memory, the tale of the 19-year-old enslaved woman who killed her master lived on in whispers, court documents, and abolitionist writings. Celia's legacy began in the courtroom. The records of her trial preserved her words, her confession, and her defense. These documents became a window into the reality of enslaved women's lives, realities that were often ignored or silenced. Through these pages, future generations would come to know Celia not just as a name, but as a young woman whose suffering revealed the darkest truths of slavery. For abolitionists, Celia's case was a rallying cry. Writers and speakers pointed to her trial as proof that the system of slavery denied justice to the very people it oppressed. They argued that if even a young woman defending herself from abuse could be condemned to death, then the law itself was corrupted beyond repair. Celia's story became evidence of the moral rot at the heart of America's peculiar institution. Within enslaved communities, Celia's legacy was even more personal. Women who endured the same violations as Celia may have found in her story a reflection of their own pain. They may have whispered her name as a reminder that they were not alone. They may have drawn strength from the fact that Celia, even in her youth, had dared to resist. The legacy of Celia also extended into the future, influencing how historians and activists understood the intersections of slavery, gender, and resistance. Celia was not just an enslaved woman, she was an enslaved woman who had fought back. Her story challenged the stereotype of passive victims and reminded the world that resistance took many forms, sometimes in silence, sometimes in survival, and sometimes in fire. Over time, Celia's story was retold in books, lectures, and classrooms. Her name became a symbol of the countless enslaved women whose voices were never recorded, whose pain was never acknowledged, and whose acts of resistance went unseen. Through Celia, we glimpse the untold stories of thousands who lived and died under the weight of slavery. Today, historians continue to study Celia's trial, not only for its legal significance, but for its human truth. Her life reminds us that slavery was not just an institution, It was a daily violation of human dignity, played out in the lives of individuals like Celia. Celia's early legacy is one of tragedy and courage. Tragedy because she was denied justice and executed at the age of 19. Courage because in her short life she dared to resist a system designed to silence her. Her story forces us to confront the brutality of the past and to honor the strength of those who fought back, even when the cost was everything. Celia of Missouri may have been hanged in 1855, but her story did not end there. Her early legacy planted seeds that would grow into movements for justice, equality, and remembrance. She lives on, not just in the records of her trial, but in the hearts of all who honor her courage. Celia of Missouri was not the first enslaved woman to resist her master, and she was not the last. But her story stands out because it was recorded, because it shook the legal system, and because it forced the public to confront a truth they preferred to silence. Enslaved women resisted slavery, and they did so in ways that revealed both courage and desperation. Celia's act of killing Robert Newsom was an act of resistance, one rooted in years of suffering. Enslaved women were subjected not only to the brutal demands of forced labor, but also to the constant threat of sexual assault. Their bodies were treated as property, exploited without recognition of their humanity. And yet, many resisted in ways both visible and invisible. Some, like Celia, resisted violently, striking back against the men who violated them. Others resisted by refusing to work, by feigning illness, or by running away. Still others resisted by protecting their children, by teaching them songs of hope, or by preserving traditions from their African heritage. Resistance did not always look like open rebellion. It often lived in the quiet, everyday acts of survival. Celia's story, however, was different because it exposed the raw reality of sexual violence under slavery. By killing her master, Celia made visible what so many enslaved women endured in silence. Her trial forced the courts, the newspapers, and the public to confront the question of whether enslaved women had the right to defend their bodies. The answer in 1855 was a resounding no. The jury that convicted Celia made it clear that the law did not recognize her resistance as justified. And yet, the very fact that her lawyers made the argument that Celia had the right to defend herself shows how her case became part of the larger tradition of resistance. Celia's story connects her to countless unnamed women whose resistance has been lost to history. For every Celia, there were many others who fought back in ways that went unrecorded. Some may have struck their abusers, some may have hidden pregnancies or resisted childbirth as acts of control over their own bodies. Others may have escaped, fleeing into the night with nothing but hope to guide them. By telling Celia's story, we honor not only her courage but also the broader tradition of black women's resistance. Celia's defiance stands alongside the women who poisoned their masters, who ran away with their children, who preserved songs of freedom, and who endured with strength. When we speak Celia's name, we place her in a lineage of women who refused to be broken. Her act was shocking to her contemporaries, but it was also a testament to the fire of resistance that burned within enslaved communities. Celia was not just a victim, she was a fighter, part of a larger story of women who resisted slavery in every way they could. Her act of defiance, though it ended with her execution, continues to echo across history. It reminds us that resistance took many forms and that enslaved women like Celia were not silent. They spoke with their actions, their courage, and their unbreakable will. Celia's trial was not just a local story, it was a legal drama that revealed the deep contradictions of slavery in America. When Celia was put on trial for the murder of Robert Newsom, her defense lawyers argued something revolutionary, that she had the right to resist his sexual assault. This argument, though obvious to us today, was extraordinary in 1855. Under the Yawai Laws of Missouri, and under the laws of slavery more broadly, enslaved people were considered property, not persons. Women like Celia were doubly oppressed, enslaved because of their race and exploited because of their gender. The law did not recognize their humanity, let alone their right to defend themselves. Yet Celia's defense attorneys insisted that she did have this right. They argued that Missouri law recognized the right of women to protect themselves from rape, and that this should apply to Celia as well, regardless of her status as enslaved. In making this case, the lawyers forced the court to confront an uncomfortable question. Did enslaved women have the same rights as free women when it came to resisting sexual violence? The jury's verdict was clear. By convicting Celia of murder, they answered that question with a devastating no. The court refused to extend legal protection to an enslaved woman. In their eyes, Celia's body belonged to her master, and her act of resistance was not self-defense but a crime. The significance of this decision cannot be overstated. Celia's trial highlighted the way the law itself was designed to protect slavery and to deny justice to the enslaved. By refusing to recognize her right to defend herself, the court made clear that enslaved women had no legal protection from sexual violence. Their bodies were considered property, and property could not resist. For abolitionists, Celia's case was powerful evidence of slavery's moral corruption. They used her story to argue that slavery was incompatible with justice, that it denied even the most basic human rights. Celia's trial became a symbol of the way the law upheld oppression rather than justice. In the broader history of American law, Celia's case stands as a reminder of how far society had to go, and how far it still had to go, to recognize the rights of women, the rights of black people, and the rights of the oppressed. Her trial forced the legal system to show its true face, a system built not on fairness, but on the preservation of power. Today, legal scholars continue to study Celia's trial. It is taught in classrooms as an example of how the law can be used to deny justice rather than provide it. It shows how laws can be twisted to protect the powerful and silence the powerless. And it reminds us that the fight for justice often begins with cases like Celia's, where one person's suffering exposes the flaws of an entire system. Celia's trial was tragic in its outcome, but significant in its legacy. It forced the world to see the brutality of slavery not just in chains and whips, but in the denial of a young woman's right to defend herself. It showed that the law was not neutral, it was a weapon of oppression, and it ensured that Celia's name would live on, not only as a story of resistance, but as a turning point in the history of justice denied. For many years after her execution, Celia's story was buried in silence. Official histories of Missouri rarely mentioned her. Local communities did not celebrate her memory. In fact, many worked to erase her from the record, to reduce her story to a line in a courtroom transcript or a brief mention in a legal archive. This silence was deliberate. Celia's act of resistance was too dangerous, too unsettling to be widely remembered in a society that still depended on slavery. Her story threatened the myth that enslaved people were content or submissive. It revealed the brutality of slavery in its most personal form, the violation of a young woman's body and her desperate fight for dignity. But silence cannot erase truth. Celia's story survived in fragments, court records, newspaper articles, and the memories passed quietly among the enslaved. For decades, her story was hidden, but not forgotten. And when historians began to dig deeper into the history of slavery, Celia's voice re-emerged. The silence around Celia is not unique. Countless enslaved women resisted in ways that were never recorded, their names lost to time. Celia is remembered not only for her own act of resistance, but also as a representative of all those whose stories remain untold. By speaking her name, we honor the silence that was forced upon so many others. In modern times, Celia has become a symbol in literature, scholarship, and activism. Writers have retold her story as a way to confront the legacy of slavery. Historians have analyzed her trial to expose the injustices of the past. Teachers have introduced her to students as a way to discuss the intersections of race, gender, and resistance. The silence of history is being broken. Celia's story is no longer confined to dusty archives. It is being spoken aloud, taught in classrooms, shared in communities, and remembered in art and writing. Each time her story is told, the silence is shattered, and Celia is restored to the place she deserves, as a voice of defiance, a symbol of courage, and a reminder of the brutal realities of slavery. But we must also recognize that the silence around Celia reflects a larger truth, that history often forgets those who resist. It forgets the voices of women, the voices of the oppressed, the voices of the enslaved. To remember Celia is to push back against that silence, to insist that her story matters, and to honor the strength she carried in her short life. Celia's silence was imposed by the society that condemned her. Today, our responsibility is to break that silence, to tell her story, and to ensure that her courage is never forgotten. Celia of Missouri, silenced in life and in death, speaks to us across the years, and in telling her story, we give her the voice she was denied. When news of Celia's trial and execution spread in 1855, abolitionists across the United States saw her story as undeniable proof of slavery's moral corruption. Celia of Missouri was not only a victim of personal cruelty, but also a symbol of a system that denied justice at every level. For abolitionists, her case became a rallying cry, a human story that revealed the brutality of an institution many Americans still defended. Celia's story was especially powerful because it showed how slavery targeted women. While abolitionists often focused on the whips, chains, and forced labor of slavery, Celia's life exposed another truth: the widespread sexual violence that enslaved women endured. By telling Celia's story, abolitionists highlighted the hypocrisy of a nation that claimed to value liberty and justice while allowing women like Celia to be assaulted without recourse. Newspapers sympathetic to the abolitionist cause reprinted accounts of her trial. Writers described the desperation of a 19-year-old girl trapped in a world where her body was owned, where her pleas for mercy were ignored, and where her only path to freedom was through violence. Abolitionist speeches referenced Celia's case as an example of slavery's inhumanity. They asked their audiences, what kind of society executes a young woman for defending herself against rape? Celia's story also gave abolitionists a way to connect with Northern women. Many white women in the North, who might otherwise have felt distant from the struggles of enslaved people, saw in Celia's suffering a reflection of their own vulnerability. If Celia, as a woman, had no right to say no to a man's advances, what did that mean for women everywhere? Abolitionists used Celia's trial to show that slavery corrupted not only the enslaved, but also the society that tolerated it. The case reached abolitionist leaders such as Frederick Douglass, who often spoke about the particular burdens slavery placed on women. While Douglass did not write extensively about Celia, her story echoed the themes he raised about how slavery stripped away dignity and humanity. Harriet Beecher Stowe, whose novel Uncle Tom's Cabin had already shocked the nation, could point to real-life stories like Celia's as evidence that her fiction was rooted in truth. Celia's name became part of the growing wave of evidence that slavery was not just an economic system, but a system of violence. By the time the Civil War began in 1861, her story had joined others in building the moral outrage that fueled the abolitionist cause. In this way, Celia of Missouri lived on not just as an individual, but as a symbol. She gave abolitionists a face, a name, and a story they could point to when they argued that slavery was a sin against humanity. Her death was tragic, but her story carried forward the fight against slavery. While Celia's case fueled abolitionist arguments, it also resonated deeply with those fighting for women's rights. Celia of Missouri was both enslaved and female, and her story revealed the double burden carried by women who lived under slavery. For women's rights activists in the mid-19th century, Celia's life and death became a reminder that the struggle for justice had to include both race and gender. At the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, only a few years before Celia's trial, women had declared that all men and women are created equal. But Celia's execution in 1855 made it painfully clear that equality was far from reality. If free women in the North were denied rights like voting and property ownership, enslaved women like Celia were denied even the right to control their own bodies. Celia's case posed a haunting question: did women have the right to defend themselves against male violence? For white women in the women's rights movement, Celia's story forced them to confront the fact that their own struggles for equality were tied to the struggles of enslaved women. While they campaigned for property rights, education, and the vote, women like Celia were fighting for survival. Activists like Sojourner Truth, herself a formerly enslaved woman, used stories like Celia's to bridge the gap between abolition and women's rights. In her famous "Ain't I a Woman?" speech, Sojourner Truth argued that black women deserved the same recognition as white women. Though she did not mention Celia by name, the themes of her speech, the strength of black women, the injustice of their suffering, resonated with Celia's story. The trial of Celia also exposed the hypocrisy of a legal system that claimed to protect women's virtue but refused to protect an enslaved woman. In Missouri, the law recognized that rape was a crime, yet in Celia's case, the court ruled that her status as enslaved denied her the right to resist. For women's rights activists, this was a powerful illustration of how the law was written to serve men and deny women autonomy. Celia's story echoed in later feminist movements as well. In the 20th century, black feminists reclaimed her memory to highlight the intersection of race and gender oppression. Writers and scholars argued that Celia's resistance should be remembered not only as part of the fight against slavery, but also as part of the fight for women's rights. For the women's rights movement, Celia became more than a historical figure. She became a reminder that the struggle for justice could not be divided. Her story demanded that women confront the realities of race and that abolitionists confront the realities of gender. She was proof that the two fights were inseparable. In the end, Celia of Missouri stood as a tragic but powerful symbol for women's rights activists. Her act of resistance and the court's refusal to recognize her humanity revealed the deep injustices that all women faced in a patriarchal society. By remembering Celia, women's rights activists could argue that their cause was not only about freedom for themselves, but about freedom for every woman, enslaved or free. After her execution in 1855, Celia of Missouri might have been forgotten entirely, reduced to a brief entry in a court record. But her story refused to disappear. Over time, she became part of the memory of slavery in America, a figure whose act of resistance continues to inspire reflection, scholarship, and remembrance. In the years immediately following her death, Celia's story lived on in whispers among the enslaved. For those still in bondage, she became a symbol of defiance, a young woman who had dared to strike back against her oppressor. Her courage gave strength to others who dreamed of freedom, even if they could not speak her name aloud. In the decades after the Civil War, when slavery was abolished, Celia's story was largely silenced in public memory. Many communities in Missouri wanted to forget the case, embarrassed by its exposure of violence and injustice. Local histories often ignored her, preferring to celebrate white settlers and politicians rather than a young enslaved woman who had resisted. But silence could not last forever. In the 20th century, historians began to uncover Celia's story from old court records and newspapers. Scholars of slavery recognized her case as one of the most important examples of how the law treated enslaved women. Writers told her story to new generations, ensuring that Celia's name was spoken again. Celia's memory also entered literature and art. Novels, plays, and poems were inspired by her life, reimagining her act of resistance as a symbol of strength. In classrooms, teachers began to use her trial as a way to teach about slavery, gender, and the law. Museums and historical societies included her in exhibits, making her story part of the larger narrative of American history. Today, Celia's memory carries multiple meanings. For some, she represents the cruelty of slavery, a reminder of the suffering inflicted on millions. For others, she represents resistance, a young woman who refused to be broken. For feminists, she represents the struggle for women's autonomy and the right to defend one's body. For legal scholars, she represents the failures of a system that denied justice. In Missouri, where she lived and died, Celia's story has begun to receive the recognition it was long denied. Historians and activists have worked to ensure that her name is remembered, not buried. Though no monuments may stand in her honor, her story has become a monument of its own, a lasting testament to courage in the face of oppression. Celia in American memory is more than just history. She is a reminder of the voices that were silenced, the stories that were hidden, and the people who resisted in ways large and small. By remembering Celia, we confront the injustices of the past and carry forward the lessons they hold. Her story forces us to ask hard questions. How do we honor those who resisted? How do we ensure their voices are not forgotten? Celia of Missouri is no longer just a name in a trial record. She is a symbol in American memory, a young woman whose act of defiance still speaks across the centuries. Celia of Missouri has become more than just a historical figure recorded in legal transcripts. Over the years, she has emerged as a powerful symbol in American literature and storytelling. Writers, poets, and dramatists have found in Celia's life a narrative that speaks to resistance, injustice, and the complexity of human courage. Through these retellings, Celia's voice, once silenced in the gallows, finds a way to echo across generations. When historians rediscovered Celia's trial in the early 20th century, authors began weaving her story into literature. Celia became a character not only of history, but also of imagination. Novelists wrote fictionalized accounts of her life, filling in the gaps where court records were silent. These works often portrayed Celia as a symbol of resilience, a young woman who refused to surrender to brutality. Writers used Celia's defiance to explore larger questions about freedom, morality, and survival. Poetry too embraced Celia's story. Poets described the moment when Celia lifted the stick against her master as an act of both desperation and empowerment. They painted Celia not as a criminal, but as a heroine, a tragic figure whose courage came at the cost of her life. Through verse, Celia's suffering was transformed into art, allowing readers to feel the emotional weight of her struggle. Theatre also found inspiration in Celia. Playwrights staged her story, bringing audiences face to face with the brutal reality of slavery. In these plays, Celia's dialogue gave her a voice she never had in court. Audiences could hear her plead for freedom, resist her oppressor, and face her execution with dignity. On stage, Celia of Missouri became not just a historical figure but a living presence, demanding empathy and recognition. In literature and art, Celia symbolizes more than individual resistance. She represents the untold stories of countless enslaved women who endured sexual violence in silence. Writers use her as a lens through which readers can understand the broader patterns of slavery's cruelty. By focusing on Celia, literature personalizes the suffering that statistics and history books often fail to capture. Importantly, Celia's symbolism in literature is not static. Different generations interpret her story in different ways. For some authors, Celia is a martyr of justice, someone who sacrificed her life in pursuit of dignity. For others, she is a feminist icon, a woman who resisted male dominance in its most violent form. For still others, she is a tragic victim, a reminder of how systemic injustice crushes individuals who dare to resist. In classrooms and universities, Celia's story is often assigned as required reading. Students encounter her in history, literature, and women's studies courses. Essays are written, discussions unfold, and debates arise. Was Celia a murderer, or was she justified? What does her story teach us about law, morality, and gender? In this way, Celia continues to spark dialogue, ensuring her memory is never forgotten. Through literature and storytelling, Celia of Missouri lives on not only as a historical figure, but as a symbol that evolves with each retelling. She challenges us to reflect on justice, freedom, and the human spirit's capacity to resist oppression. The story of Celia of Missouri comes to us not from her own words, but from court records, newspaper reports, and the testimonies of others. Scholars who study her case face the challenge of reconstructing her life from fragments. Yet through careful research and interpretation, they bring Celia's story to light, giving her a voice where history tried to silence her. Historians begin with the trial transcripts from 1855, preserved in Missouri's archives. These records contain testimonies from witnesses, questions from lawyers, and rulings from judges. Within these pages, Celia's actions are described, but always through the lens of others. Rarely does her own voice appear directly. Scholars must read between the lines, piecing together her experiences from the words of those who sought to condemn her. Legal documents reveal the stark reality of Celia's situation. They show that she was purchased at just 14, immediately subjected to sexual abuse by Robert Newsom, and forced into a life of servitude. They also reveal her attempts to resist. Celia begged Newsom's daughters to protect her. She asked her master to stop, and when ignored, she defended herself with a single strike. Scholars interpret these actions as evidence of both her desperation and her courage. Newspapers from the time add another layer to Celia's story. Reports of her trial spread across Missouri, with journalists framing her either as a dangerous criminal or as a tragic victim. By comparing these accounts, scholars can trace how public opinion was shaped by race, gender, and politics. Some papers portrayed Celia as a threat to the social order, while others acknowledged the injustices she endured. Archaeology and local history also contribute. Researchers study the environment where Celia lived, the farms, the cabins, the courtrooms. They examine the culture of 1850s Missouri, a slave state torn between North and South, to understand how her case fit into broader tensions. By placing Celia within this context, scholars reveal how her story reflected the anxieties of a society on the brink of civil war. Importantly, scholars also use imagination, what some call informed speculation. Because Celia's own words are so limited, historians ask questions like, what might she have felt when pleading with her master's daughters? How did she endure years of abuse? What emotions surged through her as she struck the fatal blow? These questions cannot be answered with certainty, but by combining evidence with empathy, scholars bring Celia's humanity to the forefront. Celia's case has inspired entire books, such as Celia, a Slave by Melton McLaurin, which reconstructs her life and trial in detail. Scholars use such works to argue that Celia's story represents not just an individual tragedy, but a window into the broader experience of enslaved women. Through academic study, Celia of Missouri becomes more than a court case. She becomes a voice in the historical record, a person whose life forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. By reconstructing Celia's story, scholars ensure that she is not forgotten. They give her dignity by telling her story with care, accuracy, and respect. In doing so, they remind us that history is not just about kings and generals, but about ordinary people like Celia, whose struggles shaped the world we live in today. In the 21st century, Celia of Missouri has become more than a historical figure. She has become a cultural icon. Her story resonates across movements for racial justice, gender equality, and human rights. Artists, activists, and educators use her name to symbolize resistance against oppression, ensuring her memory lives on in powerful ways. Celia's story has appeared in documentaries, podcasts, and public lectures. Each retelling adapts her life for new audiences, connecting her 19th century struggle to modern issues. For example, discussions of sexual violence often cite Celia as an early example of a woman who defended herself but was denied justice because of her status. In this way, Celia becomes a symbol in conversations about the Me Too and the ongoing fight against gender-based violence. Activists for racial justice also embrace Celia. Her trial illustrates how the legal system in America has historically failed black people, especially black women. By remembering Celia, modern movements highlight the continuity between past and present struggles. Celia's courage inspires protests, writings, and community events that call for change. In education, Celia is taught not only in history courses, but also in law, gender studies, and African American studies. Students debate the fairness of her trial, the meaning of her resistance, and the lessons her story holds for today. Professors encourage students to see Celia not as a distant figure, but as someone whose experiences still speak to issues of justice and equality. Celia's cultural influence extends to art. Visual artists have painted her likeness, sculptors have carved her form, and musicians have written songs in her memory. In these works, Celia is reimagined as both victim and warrior. She stands tall, a young woman who resisted her oppressor even in the face of death. Such art ensures that Celia's story remains alive, not buried in dusty archives. Community organizations have also honored Celia. In Missouri, local activists hold events to remember her life and trial. By speaking her name, they challenge the silence that once surrounded her story. For these communities, Celia represents resilience, a reminder that even in the darkest times, people resisted oppression in whatever ways they could. Celia's role as a cultural icon is especially important for black women. She embodies the intersection of race, gender, and power. Her struggle shows how black women have long been at the center of America's fight for justice, often overlooked, yet undeniably essential. By reclaiming Celia as a symbol, black feminists affirm the strength and courage of women who have resisted in both small and extraordinary ways. Today, Celia's story is not just about the past, it is about the present. She reminds us that the fight for justice is ongoing. Her resistance challenges us to ask, how do we respond to injustice? How do we honor those who came before us? How do we ensure that voices like Celia's are never silenced again? As a cultural icon, Celia of Missouri stands alongside other figures of resistance. She is remembered not only as a young enslaved woman who fought back, but also as a timeless symbol of courage. Her story belongs to history, but her meaning belongs to all of us, here and now. The trial of Celia of Missouri was not just the story of one enslaved woman who killed her master. It was the story of how an entire legal system turned its back on justice when the victim was black, female, and enslaved. Celia's trial is a chilling reminder of how laws, designed to protect society, were used to uphold slavery and deny basic humanity. When Celia was brought to trial in October 1855, she had already confessed to striking her master, Robert Newsom. But Celia explained why. She had begged him to stop abusing her, pleaded for relief, and when he forced himself on her again, she defended herself with the only weapon within reach, a heavy stick from the fireplace. This was not murder in cold blood. It was an act of desperate self-defense. But the court in Missouri refused to see it that way. At the center of the trial was a question that should have been simple. Did Celia have the right to resist sexual assault? For any free woman, the law of Missouri recognized that she had the right to fight back. But Celia was not considered a free woman. She was enslaved, and under the law of the state, she was regarded as property. This was the heart of the injustice. The court was forced to ask whether the law that protected women from sexual violence applied to Celia, an enslaved teenager. If she were white, her act would have been seen as self-defense. If she were free, her pleas might have been heard. But because she was enslaved, the court viewed her resistance as rebellion and her master's right to use her body as part of his ownership. During the trial, Celia's defense team made bold arguments. They argued that Celia's actions were justified, that she had the natural right to protect her body from assault, no matter her status. They pointed out that Celia had endured years of abuse, that she had asked Newsom to stop, that she had sought protection from his own daughters. The defense wanted the jury to see Celia not as property, but as a young woman fighting for her dignity. But the prosecution dismissed Celia's suffering. They focused instead on the fact that a slave had killed her master. To them, this was not about a woman resisting assault. It was about maintaining control over the enslaved population. If Celia's act were excused, they argued, it would set a dangerous precedent. Other enslaved people might also fight back, claiming self-defense. The prosecution framed Celia's resistance as a threat to the entire system of slavery. The judge sided with the prosecution. He instructed the jury that they could not consider Celia's right to self-defense in the same way they would a free woman's. The law, he claimed, simply did not recognize an enslaved woman's right to refuse her master. This instruction doomed Celia. Even if the jurors sympathized with her, the judge's ruling gave them little room to acquit. Witness testimonies further revealed the cruelty of the situation. Celia's teenage daughter, also enslaved, testified about the events in their cabin. Neighbors and community members spoke about Newsom's disappearance and the investigation that followed. Each piece of testimony reminded the court that Celia had killed her master, but little was said about the years of abuse she endured. Her humanity was overshadowed by her status as property. The trial became not just about Celia, but about the institution of slavery itself. Could an enslaved woman ever be recognized as a person with rights? The answer, delivered by the court, was no. Celia's suffering was irrelevant in the eyes of Missouri law. What mattered was that she had taken the life of a white man, a slaveholder, a figure of authority. By the end of the trial, the verdict was inevitable. Despite her defense team's efforts, despite the evidence of abuse, despite her clear justification, Celia was found guilty of first-degree murder. The court chose to uphold slavery rather than justice. Celia of Missouri became a victim not only of Robert Newsom's violence, but also of a legal system built to protect men like him. The trial of Celia shows us how the law can fail the most vulnerable. It shows us how courts can twist justice to maintain systems of power, and it reminds us that for enslaved women, the law was never a shield. It was a weapon used against them. After Celia of Missouri was found guilty of first-degree murder, the court moved to sentencing. The punishment was as cruel as it was predictable: death by hanging. At only 19 years old, Celia was condemned to die. The sentencing marked the final step in a process where Celia's humanity had been stripped away piece by piece. The jury had ignored her suffering. The judge had denied her the right to self-defense. Now the sentence declared that her life was forfeit, not because she committed an unjustified crime, but because she dared to resist slavery. The courtroom, where Celia was sentenced, was heavy with silence. The words of the judge carried the weight of finality. Celia was to be executed publicly. For the enslaved people of Missouri, the sentence was not only about Celia, it was a warning. The message was clear. No matter the abuse, no matter the suffering, slaves were expected to endure. To resist was to risk death. Celia's sentencing also revealed the deep hypocrisy of the system. Missouri's law claimed to protect women from rape, but only if those women were white. Celia's body was not considered her own, and so the assault she endured was invisible to the court. By sentencing her to death, the state declared that her life had less value than the life of her master. Outside the courtroom, people debated the case. Some in the white community argued that Celia deserved her fate. To them, she was a dangerous example, a slave who had crossed a forbidden line. Others, however, quietly sympathized. They recognized that Celia had been pushed to the edge, that her actions were born out of desperation. But sympathy did not translate into justice. Celia herself faced the sentence with a mix of fear and resolve. Records do not preserve her exact words, but we can imagine the weight she carried. At 19, her life should have been beginning. Instead, she waited for death, knowing that her story would end at the gallows. Yet there is reason to believe that Celia found strength in her defiance. She had resisted, she had fought back, when no one else would protect her. Even in sentencing, she remained a symbol of courage. The death sentence also exposed divisions in Missouri. The state was on the border between North and South, torn between slavery and freedom. Celia's case highlighted the contradictions of a society that called itself Christian, yet condemned a young woman for defending herself against rape. For abolitionists, Celia's sentencing was proof that slavery corrupted justice itself. The months between Celia's sentencing and her execution were filled with uncertainty. Her lawyers appealed the case, delaying the execution in the hope of a different outcome. Supporters petitioned the governor for clemency, arguing that Celia should not be executed. For a brief time, there was hope that the sentence might be overturned. But the governor refused to intervene, unwilling to challenge the system that protected slaveholders. Celia's sentencing was not just a legal act, it was a moral failure. It showed how deeply slavery was embedded in every aspect of society. By condemning her, the court sent a message that justice would always bow to power. Celia's life was sacrificed to preserve the illusion of order in a world built on cruelty. Even today, Celia's sentencing forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. It reminds us that laws can be unjust, that courts can uphold oppression, and that justice can be denied when society refuses to see the humanity of the oppressed. Celia of Missouri's death sentence was not only her tragedy, it was the tragedy of a nation that valued slavery over justice. After Celia of Missouri was sentenced to death, she spent her final days in a small jail cell, waiting for the inevitable. These last weeks of her life reveal not only her strength, but also the cruelty of a system that could condemn a young woman to die for defending herself. Celia's jail cell was cold, dim, and lonely. She had little comfort, only the company of her thoughts. At 19 years old, she had endured more suffering than most people face in a lifetime. From her teenage years, she had been abused, exploited, and silenced. Now, as she awaited execution, Celia must have reflected on the choices she had made and the injustice that had brought her here. Despite her dire situation, Celia did not give up entirely. Her lawyers continued to fight for her, filing appeals and seeking clemency. Each appeal delayed her execution, giving Celia brief moments of hope. Perhaps she thought someone in power would recognize the injustice of her case. Perhaps mercy would be shown. But those hopes were slowly crushed. The governor of Missouri refused to intervene, choosing not to challenge the powerful slaveholding class. The appeals were denied. Each legal door closed in Celia's face until only one outcome remained. During her final days, Celia was not entirely abandoned. Local abolitionists sympathized with her case. There are stories that some even attempted to help her escape from jail, though these efforts ultimately failed. For Celia, these gestures must have been bittersweet. They showed her that some people saw her humanity, but they could not save her from the system that demanded her death. Celia's thoughts in those final days are lost to history, but we can imagine her fears, her sorrows, and perhaps even her moments of quiet strength. She may have worried for her children, who remained enslaved and vulnerable after her death. She may have mourned the life she never got to live, the freedom she never tasted. Yet she may also have taken pride in knowing that she resisted. She had not allowed her master to break her completely. In striking back, she had claimed a measure of dignity, even if the cost was her life. On December 21, 1855, Celia was led to the gallows. The execution was public, meant to serve as a warning to others. Crowds gathered, some out of morbid curiosity, others to witness the power of the state. For Celia, each step toward the gallows was a step away from the world that had denied her humanity. We do not know her final words, but her silence itself was powerful. In her death, Celia became more than an enslaved woman condemned by a court. She became a symbol of resistance. Her final moments stood as a testimony to the injustice of slavery and the cruelty of a society that punished the oppressed for defending themselves. Celia's execution marked the end of her life, but not the end of her story. In the years that followed, her memory lived on in whispers, in abolitionist writings, and later in historical research. Today, her final days remind us not only of the injustice she endured, but also of her courage in the face of despair. As Celia of Missouri walked to the gallows, she carried with her the weight of history, the pain of countless enslaved women, the cruelty of an unjust system, and the hope that her act of resistance would not be forgotten. In her final days, Celia was both victim and heroine, silenced in life, but immortal in memory. On the morning of December 21, 1855, the world of Celia of Missouri came to its cruel end. 19 years old, barely a woman, Celia was led from her jail cell to the gallows. Her crime, the court had said, was murder. But in truth, Celia's only crime was defending herself against years of abuse that no human being should have endured. As the jail doors creaked open, Celia stepped out into the cold winter air. The sky was gray, the ground hard with frost, and the streets of Fulton, Missouri, were filled with spectators. News of her execution had spread quickly, and crowds had gathered not just from curiosity, but to witness the state's demonstration of power. For the enslaved, her death was a warning. For the white slaveholding community, her death was reassurance that order would be maintained. Celia's walk to the gallows was short but heavy with meaning. Each step represented the weight of a society that had denied her humanity. Shackles bound her wrists, but her head was held high. She had already endured years of degradation and violence. Nothing they did now could take away the fact that she had fought back. At the gallows, the wooden structure loomed tall, grim, and final. The rope dangled above, waiting for her neck. Officials read the sentence aloud once more. Celia of Missouri was to be hanged until dead. The words echoed across the square, sealing the injustice in public memory. We do not know Celia's final words. History did not preserve them. Some say she remained silent, her eyes cast forward. Others believe she may have spoken quietly, perhaps a prayer, perhaps a final thought for her children left behind in bondage. Whatever her last words, her silence or speech carried the weight of centuries of suffering endured by enslaved women like her. When the trapdoor opened, Celia's body dropped, and with it, the life of a young woman whose only wish had been to live free from abuse. The crowd dispersed, some satisfied, others shaken. But the story did not end there. Celia's execution was more than the death of one person. It was a message, a performance of power, meant to remind enslaved people of their place. Yet in silencing, Celia, Missouri also created a martyr, a figure whose story would one day resurface to challenge the very system that killed her. When Celia of Missouri's body hung lifeless on the gallows, the immediate shock soon gave way to silence. For the white community, life returned to normal, as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Robert Newsom's family carried on, the plantation continued, and slavery's grip remained strong. But beneath the surface, the aftermath of Celia's death left deep scars. For enslaved people, Celia's execution was a chilling reminder of their vulnerability. Her story spread through whispers among the enslaved. A young woman had dared to fight back, and she paid with her life. To some, Celia became a symbol of courage. To others, her fate was a warning of the dangers of resistance. The memory of Celia lingered in cabins and fields, shaping the way enslaved women understood their own struggles. Celia's children suffered the heaviest loss. They had already lived as the children of an enslaved mother, vulnerable and unprotected. Now, with Celia gone, their futures became even more uncertain. Without their mother's protection, they faced the same cycle of exploitation and hardship. Celia's fight had been for herself, but also for them. For a chance at dignity, for a chance to live without the shadow of abuse. Her death left them motherless, bound to the system that had destroyed her. Among Missouri's slaveholding class, Celia's execution was seen as justice served. Newspapers at the time wrote of her crime in cold, detached terms, describing her act of resistance as dangerous and unlawful. Rarely did they mention her suffering, her years of abuse, or the circumstances that had led her to strike back. Her humanity was erased in print, just as it had been erased in court. Yet not everyone agreed. Abolitionists in the North seized on Celia's story as evidence of slavery's moral corruption. They wrote about her courage, her desperation, and the injustice of her trial. To them, Celia's death was not the act of justice the court had claimed. It was the act of a society so enslaved to slavery itself that it could not recognize basic human dignity. The aftermath of Celia's death also revealed the fragility of the system that killed her. Slaveholders needed the spectacle of her execution to reinforce their power. The fact that a teenage girl could so deeply threaten the order of slavery spoke volumes. Celia's resistance was a crack in the foundation of bondage, a reminder that even those most oppressed could rise up. In the years that followed, Celia's name faded from public record. She was buried without honor, without remembrance, her grave unmarked. But her story was never truly lost. It survived in court documents, in whispers, and in the quiet strength of those who remembered her as more than a slave, as a young woman who resisted. Though Celia of Missouri died on the gallows in 1855, her legacy has only grown with time. What seemed at first to be the silencing of a slave girl became, in history's eyes, the voice of resistance against one of the most brutal institutions in American history. Celia's act was simple yet profound. She refused to submit. In striking, her master Celia declared that her body was her own, that her dignity could not be erased, and that slavery, no matter how powerful, could not fully crush her spirit. This act of defiance became her legacy. Historians later uncovered Celia's story through court records, piecing together the fragments of her life. These documents revealed not just the facts of her case, but the deeper truths about slavery itself. They showed how the law treated enslaved women as property, denying them the right to protect themselves. They showed how society dismissed their suffering, prioritizing the rights of slaveholders over the lives of the enslaved. And they showed how, even in the face of such oppression, individuals like Celia could resist. Today, Celia's name is spoken with reverence by those who study the history of slavery. She is remembered alongside other enslaved women who fought back, women whose resistance often went unrecorded. Celia's story gives voice to the countless women whose struggles were buried under silence. Her legacy also forces us to confront hard questions about justice. What does it mean when the law denies humanity? What happens when courts uphold oppression instead of protecting the vulnerable? Celia's trial and execution show how deeply slavery corrupted American justice. Her story challenges us to recognize the ways in which law can still fail the marginalized today. In classrooms, in books, and in public memory, Celia's story continues to inspire. Artists and writers have reimagined her life, giving her the voice she was denied in her own time. Activists invoke her courage as a reminder that resistance is possible, even in the darkest circumstances. Celia of Missouri's legacy is not just about the past. It is about the ongoing struggle for dignity, justice, and recognition. She was not only a victim, she was a fighter. Her courage lives on as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of cruelty. Today, more than a century and a half after Celia of Missouri walked to the gallows, her story continues to resonate. Though she died young, her act of resistance and the injustice of her trial make her one of the most important figures in the history of American slavery. Remembering Celia means remembering the countless enslaved women who endured abuse in silence. It means acknowledging that the history of slavery was not only about forced labor. It was about the violation of bodies, the denial of humanity, and the crushing of spirits. Celia's story brings this truth into sharp focus. Her story is now taught in schools and universities as an example of both resistance and injustice. Scholars use her case to show how the law functioned under slavery, how women's bodies were commodified, and how courage could still emerge in the darkest moments. Celia's name, once nearly forgotten, has become a symbol of remembrance. But remembering Celia is also an act of responsibility. It forces us to ask, how do we honor those who resisted oppression? How do we keep their stories alive in a world that often forgets the marginalized? To remember Celia is to continue telling her story, to ensure that her act of defiance is never erased. Celia's life may have ended in 1855, but her spirit remains in the fight for justice. She reminds us that resistance is possible, that silence can be broken, and that even those the world tries to erase can endure in memory. The gallows may have claimed her body, but history has claimed her voice. And today, when we speak her name, Celia of Missouri, we honor not only her struggle, but the struggle of all who resisted slavery. Celia's story is not just history. It is a legacy. It is a reminder. It is a voice calling across the centuries that dignity matters, that justice matters, and that no act of resistance, however small, is ever truly forgotten.